Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, we are on the second topic in our anomalous phone call, topic. The first one focused on calls from the dead. This one, it's everything else. Everything else that fits in there. Predominantly, it's going to be on demonic phone calls, though. That just happens to be most of what I found. But anything that doesn't qualify as a call from a dead loved one, that's in this podcast. And we have some fan-submitted stories in this one, so that's going to be interesting. Now, before we jump into all of that stuff, if you have an effed up story, or a picture, or a video, we want you to submit that to us, which you can do on our official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the menu, click submissions, fill out the form, click submit. We'll get it on the website, and we'll get it into the podcast because we're covering all of your submissions. We're going to get them all in podcasts. And we also are going to be doing a podcast in the next week or two on near-death experiences. And that one is going to scare you straight. I got one submission already, and this is going to be one of our bigger topics. If you have a story on it, I realize it's rare, but I really, really want you guys to send them in if you have it. We'll get it into the podcast. Get it in ASAP. We're looking at a week or two from now, okay? That having been said, we're going to jump into the topic for tonight. And it's phantom phone calls predominantly involving demons. Okay, so what is a phantom phone call? Well, it can be something like the following. The phone rings. You pick it up. There's nobody there. Now, this can be a technical issue, but it becomes a little more mysterious when it happens multiple times. You pay to trace the call, and the number you're provided with doesn't exist with any carrier. Now, I know that in today's world, some of this stuff can happen via Skype or other VoIP services, but generally, a lot of these stories come from a time when that didn't exist. We're talking 20, 30 years ago, before the internet was a thing. We didn't have those fancy apps. But yet, this kind of shit happened. Another thing that happens is you're getting a call from someone, you have a conversation with them, and somehow later, you're talking to said person, and you reference this prior conversation, and a cold look of confusion sets in on their face. They didn't call you, or maybe that conversation was had with someone else, yet you have information you shouldn't possibly know. That phone call never actually happened. To you it did, but it didn't actually happen somehow. And I know that, this topic is niche, but this is somewhat more common within this niche. And of course, we have the even more mysterious calls as well. And these are the calls that happen at 3 a.m. every morning, the witching hour. It's the calls where it sounds like demons on the other end. Or maybe you're hearing screaming and static. Or maybe it sounds like a person, but they keep repeating the same phrase. Their voice is raising and lowering in pitch and speed, and they don't seem to respond to your questioning or communication, and eventually the line goes dead. These are all common experiences in an uncommon topic, if you follow me. And here's a small example of just such an experience that I just mentioned. Now, I read this story online somewhere, and this comes from a woman named Maya. And she had gotten a new cell phone, and one day it was just sitting on her dresser while she was watching TV. And suddenly she notices this black cloud-like substance hover on into the room, hover over the phone, and disappear, as if it had went into the phone. Now, she shrugged this off as her imagination, but then she started to have all kinds of strange problems with her phone. She had trouble reaching friends and family, and then there would always be static on the line. And then, she was having trouble getting calls from her contacts. People couldn't get through. At some point, her circle started questioning her about it, and she chalked it up to bad reception. And this was all fine and dandy until she gets a call, or she runs into a coworker. It was a very important work contact. And apparently she actually got through. But what she heard was an ugly, distorted voice of her friend that she described as demonic-like in nature. And it kept repeating, "Maya's not here today," over and over until the phone died. Now, is that effed up or what? So
That's definitely a strange one.
Yeah, right? I mean, I would be a little bit alarmed if I called you and I heard the evil version of Ryan, and he just kept responding the same phrasing over to me, not responding to me, almost robotic in nature. That would kind of freak me out.
That would be scary, because I think I am the evil version of me. So
yeah, God help us. If there's a worse version out there, we need priests here right now.
Yeah.
But we're gonna jump into our first fan submission, and this was submitted by Joey Snook, and it has to do with a cursed phone that he had. And I'm going to say right now, he also has another story on the site that's kind of an extension to this, but it doesn't really involve the phone. Very interesting, and we will cover it at some point, but if you guys wanted to go over and read that, is one of the newer stories on the site right now. But anyway, this story happened back in 2008. The title of this story, by the way, is called "My Phone is Cursed," if you want to read the original. So it's 2008. He's living in the city of Vancouver, and he has these strange occurrences with a particular cell phone that he bought secondhand. So that's the first thing. Never buy a phone secondhand. It's probably been in the bathroom. But anyway, so these strange occurrences that he experienced were very odd. This is the way he described it. So it starts when he tried phoning his mom's cell phone. And of course, like most of us mommy's boys, we have our mom on speed dial. And instead of getting his mom, he gets this creepy guy who picks up the phone. And he said he had this sinister laugh. And in the background, he could hear these footsteps echoing as if he was walking down this long hallway or in an empty room. At this point, Joey's pretty freaked out. His hairs are standing up. And he ends the call, but he double checks, to make sure that he phoned the right number. And sure enough, it was his mom's phone number that he phoned. I mean, this is on speed dial. If it's anything like my cell phone, you just tap it. So he redials the phone number, and this time his mom picks up, and he was speechless, couldn't figure it out. He didn't even remember what he phoned for why he even phoned in the first place. And he was just totally taken aback by, what just happened. So he wondered, maybe it's a technical thing, but, is it possible that he phoned a phantom instead of the other way around? Instead of him being called by a phantom, did he call a phantom? So that's his first experience. His second experience, it happened when he would get these calls on his phone at 3 a.m. Now, I don't need to tell you the significance of 3 a.m., right? First of all, we know it's the witching hour. Second of all, in every possession movie ever made, that's when it happens. It's 3 a.m., right?
That's when the clock stops.
And 3 a.m., the number 3, of course, we know is the mocking of the tritone, right? And that's why
The
when
Trinity.
the Trinity. That's why when you see demons marks, it's in scratches, it's in threes. It's why it's 3 o'clock. It's why all these things happen in threes. So that's significant. Now, as like myself, Joey is a night owl, okay, and he's usually awake at this time. And of course, the number that shows up on his phone is 666-666-6666. And if you already know about the prank involving that number, we'll get to that. But we're separating it from the story from right now. So this is the number that shows up. And he answers the phone, and what he heard was demonic growling, snarling, and hissing. And he also had a distinct feeling as if he were being watched. And by his own admission, he was literally petrified by this call. I mean, he had a very hard time sleeping when this happened. So that's experience number 2. And experience number 3, he gets, again, it's a weird number. He's playing video games, and he gets this number. And this time, the number is all zeros. 000000000. And this time when he answers, he said it was an evil sounding voice, and it was talking extremely fast. And I found this detail interesting. He described it being somewhat like an auctioneer, but even faster than that. And he felt the same sensation of fear like he had with, the previous call with the all 6 number, right? And he sat there frozen. He's petrified, and he's listening to this terrifying voice until it stops. And then, once this had happened, he destroys his phone, and his reasoning being that somebody must have cursed this phone. I mean, it was a secondhand phone after all. So he thinks that possibly some talismanic magic might have been, an explanation from this. And he even after he destroyed the phone, he didn't have any more phantom phone calls. But I will say that his other story kind of it's not about the phone, so I'm not going to tell it right now. But that whole talismanic magic kind of ties in. So if you want to read that whole thing as well. So, it's possible that he had a cursed phone. Possibly. I mean, that's a bizarre thing to have happen.
Now, of course, I mean, in today's day and age, people don't really talk about cursed items that much. It comes up in our world because, of course, we deal with the esoteric and the niche. But cursed objects can sometimes be linked to not necessarily somebody doing a specific ritual, but something that's been infused with a large amount of negative energy. Perhaps the phone was, he got it secondhand. Maybe it belonged to an individual who was connected with dark rituals and magic, somebody who mired themselves in that kind of a world. Even the modern warlock would probably need a cell phone. It's not all crystal balls and tarot these days. So I mean, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that you would have a modern device that is connected to somebody who is involved in magic or spirit mediumship. But I guess the other, because when I read the story, I was thinking, what's the chances of course we get, there's a certain percentage of 0.00001% of people get phantom phone calls. Now, what's the chances of you accidentally phoning a phantom? But we always talk about these strange places and strange instances where we have a a conjunction of the physical world and the spirit realm. And, maybe on the electronic level, those things become even more likely, even though they're extremely unlikely. Perhaps there's something a little more ephemeral about digital electronic devices that have this connection with electricity and the electromagnetic uh, um, world, that the spirit realm seems to link itself to.
Well, one thing I will say about a second story, I'm not going to tell that story right now because I think it deserves its own podcast. But on the topic of, cursed objects, he happened to have a cursed iPod. Very unlucky individual. But
Did it come with a free Frogurt? I know we've done that
it
joke.
did, but it was cursed as well. But in Joey's case, he ended up, at the end of his story, running into a native, and he asked him about the possibility of people cursing these objects. And it was a common practice amongst his culture to curse objects that they believe would be stolen by people, or that kind of thing. People who they felt deserved it, so they would curse these objects. Someone would steal it, or something of that nature, and then they would have this curse with them. And just because that happened to him with the iPod, now he believes that maybe it was his iPod all along and not his phone, and maybe that's the case, or maybe maybe he was unlucky enough to have a cursed cell phone as well. So
somebody out there is cursing cell phones and iPods and selling them on Kijiji.
He's living in the same neighborhood, perhaps. Perhaps he keeps going to the same store. No, but
stop buying your electronics at the little curiosity shop.
Well, I know his iPod was given to him, but the moral of the story, I guess, is just certain things you don't buy used. Cell phones, I think, would be one of them. There's only, most likely.
It's more of a hygiene thing.
It is. It's probably been in the bathroom. And
but
if you're,
I guess one thing you can take away whenever you're bringing anything into your home, depending on your philosophical or spiritual leanings, if you are a big believer in the spirit world and its connections to demonic forces or non-human spiritual forces, perhaps it would behoove you to perform a cleansing ceremony of some sort with said object, especially if it's a second-hand object which may have a history of its own.
I guess it comes down to how lazy you are. I mean, even knowing that, I probably won't, because I've yet to buy a cursed object, so I'm batting 100 right now. I'm fairly okay, but I guess if this happens to you multiple times, it might be something to consider. Now that said, something I do want to jump on to regarding Joey's story was that number 66666. The all sixes, because I know if you go and Google this, you're gonna come across. I mean, it was used for many pranks. Okay, like, obviously, someone happens to get that number. What a perfect number to do pranks with, right? So, I mean, this was a real number that was passed around to many different people, and it seemed like everybody who got their hands on it, just went and did mischievous activities with it. And finally, the carrier or whoever officially owned it had to unlist it as an option for anybody, because it was just prank calls being made with it. In fact, I read about a website that used to exist that owned the phone number, and they actually had it set up so that people could contact them with the whole purpose of pranking one of their friends. Like, they'd give them some information who to call, and they'd call and like do this kind of thing to scare the shit out of them, right? So, of course, that being the case, even though this happens and has happened, that doesn't always fit the same mold, right? I've also read about a woman who was awoken by a call from that number at like 3 a.m. And I realized that don't really mean anything in itself, but when she woke up, she woke to find her house was on fire and was billowing smoke through the hallways. To her, the number was more than just a little creepy, obviously. Though if it were me, I'd also kind of look at it as, you know, it possibly saved her life, you know. Actually, it most likely did. It woke her up so that she could get out. But I digress. Now, we do have a story involving demonic phone calls that was submitted as well. But before we get into that one, I want to tell a story that I came across that, you know, better shows the reality of these demonic phone calls and shows that it's not a prank. And I mean, this one, when I came across it, you know, I don't scare really easily. I mean, I read this stuff before I go to bed. I've watched every horror movie. I do it by myself. I play, you know, even as a teenager, I'd be playing Silent Hill by myself in the room with the lights off, 3 in the morning. I mean, this is just my thing. A bad dream to me most of the time is interesting. I wake up and think it was an entertaining dream. So when I read something and I leave the house and I'm paranoid, as Ryan put it earlier, that's how you know it's a good story, right? So that's the way that I felt with this one. Now I realize that might not be the same for you, but here we go. So this story, I mean, there's a book about it, okay? But I'm just going to summarize, and I'm only focusing on the area that, you know, relates as far as the phone is. It comes from a man by the name of Bill Scott, and he used to work on a religious radio station. And the book he wrote is called The Day Satan Called. And in this book, he tells, you know, this whole story in much more detail. But I'm just going to, again, summarize this section that I read to you guys. So, anyway, this all began when he was working, you know, he was at the station, and he gets this call, and he answers it, and, you know, keeping in mind that this was a week before Halloween, and this was 20 years ago, before we had the fancy apps, before we had VoIP, but, you know, it's still a week before Halloween. You know, it's easy to assume this to be a prank, but anyway, he gets this call from what he said sounded like a little girl, and she said her name was Lacey. And Lacey was very jittery on the phone. You know, for all intents and purposes, she sounded terrified. And she said that on Halloween night, she was going to be sacrificed. And she was begging for help, pleading for help. She was terrified she was going to be sacrificed. And Bill, being someone, you know, religious, I mean, he works at a religious radio station, he offered to go and pick her up, to help her out. And as soon as he makes that offer, this demonic voice takes over the phone and says, "You're not going to have her. She's ours." So right like that, you know, after that happens, you know, Bill starts with that all too familiar, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you out of that body" type of, you know, stuff we've heard from every movie from the dawn of time. But
power of Christ compels
the power of Christ compels you. And as he starts with this, you know, and I guess it, you know, they say it because it works, right? You command it in Jesus' name, and it gets it out of there because Jesus has the power to command him out. And as he starts this, you know, of course, whatever it was on the phone, you know, just bursts in this vulgarity storm at him, and the phone goes dead. Right? I mean, this is kind of what we expect to have happen with this. And naturally, Bill is a little shaken, right? But more than anything, like a lot of us, he assumes it's a Halloween prank. Makes sense, right? Right time of year. But of course, these calls continued for another 3 nights. And he was starting to get real tense and freaked out by it. And it just so happens that a coworker of his, who was named Susan, had heard about it. And Susan happened to have experience with occult-related work and offered to try and help. So, you know, one night at the radio station, Bill gets another one of these calls from Lacey, and he's having this conversation with her. It's a prolonged conversation. And that's when Susan sneaks into the room ever so quietly. No one acknowledges her. She's a ghost as far as an alleged prankster on the phone is concerned. But soon after Susan enters the room, once again, this demonic voice takes over the call and says, "Susan, where have you been? We missed you." So it's intelligent. It's there. It somehow knows, right? And all of this time, you know, in each of these nightly calls, Bill is trying to meet up with this young girl to help her. Like, every time he gets one of these calls, he's extending his hand. He's trying to reach out. He's trying to meet up with this girl so he can help her. You know, he's a good Samaritan. And he finally manages to persuade her, you know, to meet him. And the plan was that he was going to meet him on the porch of an abandoned building next door to the radio station. And I got the feeling that's more her idea, because I don't know if I'd want to meet in front of an abandoned building. I'd just come to the radio station. But anyway, that's what their plan is, right? So, you know, fast forward to the night that they're supposed to meet. He gets a call from her. And, you know, you're in a radio station. You know, you got in an office. And I know many of you work in an office, so you know you have phone lines all over that building. All these inside lines, right? So they're in a radio station. And when he gets this call, he gets it from an inside line. Okay? So she's supposedly in the radio station. And when he picks up and he starts to talk, they're on the phone for 30 seconds maybe, and the phone dies. And then another line lit up, and it's Lacey again. And then her call began to bounce from every phone line around the building. An impossibility for one person to do. You know, like, this phone is bouncing from room to room to room to room, and it's coming in, and it's her. It's not possible for her to be in all these different rooms so quickly. And finally, he gets into a conversation with her, and he gets her to agree to meet again. And she goes to the alleged spot in front of this abandoned building, right next to the radio station. And Bill goes outside, and he sees her on the porch. And I guess she's at a distance. He can't really get a good look at her, but he can see her there. And as he approaches, he's walking towards her. He calls out to her. And then she turns and runs into a brick wall, which was behind her, and simply vanishes. And when he finally... I mean, he's just blown away by this. It doesn't make sense. How does somebody run into a brick wall and disappear? But these calls continue. And he finally manages to meet up with her, okay? He meets up for a sit-down, face-to-face. And he was very surprised to find that this was no little girl that he was hearing on the phone, but it was a woman in her mid-30s. And honestly, you know, the story just gets more bizarre from there. You know, in an effort to help the woman, he invites her into his home, and, you know, she's possessed. He doesn't know this at the time, but she's possessed. So by doing this, he actually invites a demon into his home. And he ends up having full-on crazy exorcist-like stuff happening in his house for the full 2 weeks that she's there. And here's where it gets a little disturbing. It turns out that... and this happens okay, so she's there for 2 weeks, and there's all this poltergeist-like activity going on, okay? And he got a wife, and they're praying for her, and they're trying this stuff, and it's chaotic. They can't, you know, they know that they can't keep this up, and so his solution was to get her into a woman's shelter, which he does. It takes 2 weeks, and he gets her into a woman's shelter, and when she's gone, you know, something is like he heard a voice, right? He heard a voice, and it said to look under the bed that she was staying in, and when he did, he found, like, this old robe and these old occult-like, I don't know if a relic is the right word, but, you know, obvious things that you would use if you were into the occult. And he took it and he burned it and stuff like that, but, you know, it caused him to look further into who she was and her background. And it turns out that she had been a member of a coven, and her parents and this is disturbing, her parents had used her as a sexual slave to breed babies that they could use as sacrifices. She was also forced into drinking blood and cannibalism. So, I mean, she was lost, I guess, before this even started. When, you know, Bill finally gets her into the home and he finds this stuff out, you know, it seems like he didn't really want any, you know, he didn't really want to be around. I can't really blame him, but of course, nothing.
It's about as dark as that kind of scenario gets.
It's about as dark as it gets, but, you know, it it doesn't even end there. Like, I mean, there's a lot more to that story. That's just a snippet, and I really only wanted to discuss it as far as the phone line, or the demonic phone calls was related. But you know, when she went to the woman's shelter, I mean, that place went bananas too. I mean, wherever she went, you know, this demonic and poltergeist like activity followed her. And I mean, from what I read, this went through several different people and went through different. You know, eventually, I think he did end up helping, but you know, I didn't read the whole book. I just found like so much of it online. But very very interesting stuff. So if that tickles your fancy, actually, I might pick up his book. I really like what I read. But that book is out there. It's called The Day Satan Called. But yeah, so I mean, there's a perfect example of demons calling you on the phone. In this case, it seemed like they spoke through her as the conduit. You know, they possessed her and called her. And it's interesting that it was the sound of a young girl, and it ended up being a woman in her mid-30s. And from what the indication I got is that in person she didn't sound like that, right? I mean, it was able to disguise itself on the phone in that way.
Well, that's mimicry, again, being a very classic kind of demonic ploy. You know, using the voice or the apparition of a child to lure some. You know, I mean, that's kind of what I like. Of course, I personally, I haven't heard this story before right now. And, you know, when you first started telling the story, I thought, geez, you know, this guy's going to get killed. You know,
why am I laughing at that? There's something wrong with me.
Because you're twisted like me.
I'm twisted. We're twisted.
You know, there's this little girl's voice trying to lure this guy, you know, oh, just come and meet me at this abandoned warehouse. These people are trying to sacrifice me. I mean, you know, that's not like any scene in any horror movie ever.
Geez, that's a consistent thread, isn't it? You got the fairies luring you. You got the will-o'-the-wisps luring you. You have demons luring. Everything is to trick you. It's all trickery. You got the jinn luring you, I think.
And that goes to Chris O'Brien's whole thing, the archetype of the trickster.
Oh, yes. Skinwalker Ranch.
There you go.
So don't trust anyone or anything. That's what we learn.
Never help anyone ever.
Unless it's me. I might need some help. In more ways than one. But anyway, so that's that story. Now we're gonna jump into a submission that again it deals with demonic phone calls and it's not quite as extreme as that, but you know, it still has a creepy, it has a insidious type of insidious theme to it that I relate to in some ways, and maybe we'll discuss that after we go tell the story. But this story comes from,
and it's connected to everybody's favorite paranormal investigative couple,
Ed and Lorraine Warren. This story actually comes from Robert Trumbull, and I think we covered his story, Psychic Showdown. He sent in a couple, and he's proven to be a very interesting fellow, and has had many interesting experiences, and he's had the luck to work with Ed and Lorraine Warren. I don't know if luck is the right word. I'm sure it's pretty harrowing to work with them.
At least he had the opportunity to work with these paranormal legends.
It also means that he has he's gifted, because he made a side note in his story, and I'm just going to get that out of the way first. Essentially what it is that Robert and a group of individuals, okay, there was a group that worked with Ed and Lorraine Warren, and they were to help them. As I guess you would say, Ed and Lorraine were the leaders. You know, they would respond to calls and stuff like that. But they had a group that would help, and this group was made. It was a special group because they all had, they had proven their skills in paranormal situations, but they also had special gifts, and these gifts were gifts that could be used by Ed and Lorraine's. They could use it to their advantage. And I know that Robert is mentioned being an empath, and he was a demon. He is a demonologist. He has, so he has. He's psychic as well. I mean, that's the whole last podcast he did. So I mean, he's gifted. He has special gifts that not just anybody could have, and I guess that's why he was so suited to work with Ed and Lorraine Warren. And that's the whole group. The whole group was like that. So Robert's story this time, it takes place in Connecticut. And of course, he was working with Ed and Lorraine. He said it was midsummer, and they had just finished with a house hunting in Massachusetts. And Ed had been telling the team about these phantom phone calls that he would get prior to a demon or other entity their release request. Okay, and the team thought that this was all a joke. They didn't really take it seriously. And they went back to Robert's apartment, Robert went back to his apartment, and there's certain exercises and things that he has to do to strengthen himself for these situations, and that's what he was doing. He was preparing himself, and as he put it, it's basically meditation and out of body travel. Okay. And he says when he talks about the universal thread, he compares it to the internet. And with training, like meditation and these exercises, you can tap into this thread, okay? Or you can see it, you can feel it. It's a band of energy that he says connects everything, every dimension, every word, every being, and it allows people to travel and or communicate across these threads. And it's also a very powerful source. Or it's a power source, okay? And he was trained to tap into it and get energy from it. So from that, we move on to the actual phone call. Now, he says it has been, he was doing this meditation for about 3 days. And he said he was in the middle of cooking dinner, and he gets this phone call. And of course, when he answers it, there's nobody there. So he hangs up. And as soon as the receiver hits the base, it rings again. So Robert puts it to his ear, and he says, hello. And he said he heard the most god-awful screams and growls. He thought it was just someone from the team pranking him. And he says, nice one, but, I don't scare that easily. And he hangs up. And a short time later, the phone rings again. And he answers. And once again, screams and growls. He starts to hang the phone up when a voice, he said, now this wasn't completely human. He said it has like a animalistic quality to it. But he said he hears this voice and it says, you will not defeat me. And he hangs up the phone. And he had a journal. Actually, the whole group had these journals, and they were required to record, all these kinds of things, paranormal things that they would experience into them. So he grabbed his journal and he jotted down what had happened. And the next day, Ed called, and he said that he was needed. Ed needed him. And anyway, so when he finally meets up with Ed, he says that every member of the team had been experiencing these phantom phone calls, or demonic phone calls, really, and exactly the same time that Robert was experiencing it. And that's when Ed informed the group that they are now and forever will be on the darkness's radar. And the thing about that is, and I find it a little bit of hits close to home from Ryan when you and I were into the occult stuff. It's kind of funny, you go looking for that stuff and it finds you, right? I mean,
stare into the abyss and you might find it staring back.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? I mean, if we look back at our paranormal experiences, most of my paranormal experiences happened all around that same time when we were looking into that stuff. And it's not because I was doing rituals or because I was, I wasn't really doing that. I was just kind of researching it, and I was just, I was taking it in that way. I wasn't really practicing it, we'll say, but just being involved that far, or probably hanging around with you.
Well, I was going to say it could also have something to do with the fact that I was mired pretty deeply in it, and I was doing rituals and I was practicing.
Well, yeah, maybe. So, I mean, for me, when that stuff kicked off and we started experiencing that stuff, it kind of felt like what Robert said, like, he was doing the stuff and he got these calls, and that was their sign to say that you're now on the radar, right?
I seem to even remember there was a particular day, there was a storm blowing in. Well, it wasn't really a storm. It was just, like this strange weather had settled over the city, and you called me. You were all freaked out because you had several strange phone calls with just static on the line, and then our phone call kept getting cut off, and there was this strange static squealing through the phone call, and I remember rushing over to your place after being unable to get you on the phone, and just I can't remember a whole lot of specific events of that day, but I just remember that the whole it even even the light seemed to be filtering strangely through the clouds, and there was an entire oppressiveness to the atmosphere when I went outside. It was a really weird day. I just remember that you were almost frantic on the phone, and we couldn't barely hear one another because of all the static and this weird squelching.
Now, honest to God, until you just mentioned it, I had completely forgot about it. But as you started saying it, I started to remember that little bit and just a little details. I forget most of it, but I do remember that whole summer or that whole year, it was at least a year, permeated with darkness. It really was. There was an oppressiveness and a heaviness and everything was just a little bit more strange, right? Like there was lots of little anomalies that would happen. I know that you and your wife, when you came over, would always be seeing dark orbs, freaking me out, saying that oh yeah, an orb just flew in your head. It's like, really? Really?
I didn't feel anything.
It's like,
did it leave a mark?
Is it in yet? No. I just it was bizarre, right? Like and that whole summer, I mean, how you mentioned the light, the light filtered weird from the clouds and stuff. And I mean, there was a number of days like that. I even remember us going to that old highway, because we went back there several times, because we had experiences there, wanting to see it again. And I remember going there one night. It was like 2 or 3 in the morning. It was like pitch black. It was pouring down buckets of rain, and it was just the feeling that we'd get there was so dark and oppressive. Of course, we had the anomalous phone calls. We had the people we knew that had really bad stuff happen to them. It was like curses, right? It was like people were cursed. And it was a weird time. And in some ways, I look back on with fondness on the mysteriousness of it. But I didn't like the whole being targeted part of it, and some of the creepy stuff that happened to us. I mean, it's a different feeling. I know it sounds weird to say that. I had a weird feeling. I mean, how many people's story starts with that, right? I felt something. It's like, because it's something you're trying to describe that you really can't convey it, right? When you say I felt something, that doesn't mean anything to most people, and that's partly why our stories seem so bland in comparison to most of these, because when we explain it, it doesn't really sound like a big deal. It felt like a big deal to us because we could perceive with our 5 senses all these different things that we can't really put into words in a way that it matters to anybody. But spooky stuff. So that's another Robert's story there with the with the demonic phone calls, the warnings, right? And it was just the acknowledgement that they're on this radar and forever will be. And Ryan, in our case, from doing that is almost like, in some ways, we would never not be involved in paranormal because we like it too much, right?
Yes.
But we also mostly, especially these days, we only interact with that so far as it is to read it on the internet, right? I mean, we're not going to people's houses. We're not doing field research. I mean, I would if I was in a good location for it because I'm interested in it, but we're not. We're not in a good location. We don't have the money, so we just sit at home and read this stuff. But, basically what I'm trying to get at here is that since we dealt with that stuff, we've been put on a path where we can't really escape it, right? I mean, our podcast, I know it's not super successful or nothing, but it did way better than we thought it would do. And it did well enough that we keep coming back and doing it because there's enough people that want to hear it. And I still managed to keep running and meeting strange people my whole life, right? So in some ways, it's like once we open that door, you can't close it again, right? It's like
I know even to this day, because it wasn't just your place that my wife and we weren't married at the time. We're married now. That we both since that time have seen many orbs and shadow figures, because that's something I used to see in that old place of yours a lot was a man-sized shadow figure. And I mean, to this day I still have it. We have it in the place that we live currently. And my wife actually made a comment to me the other day that she's after experiencing it a lot more frequently in the last few weeks. I tend not to elaborate too much on it because I don't want to freak her out, but I'm sure she can hear me now, so it doesn't matter. But I'm after seeing quite a few things lately myself. Again, mostly shadow figures or a near person sized distortion in the air that moves away quickly when I focus on it. So it has been something that has followed me my whole life. And I mean, let's face it, I was in there deep when I got into Satanism and studying demonology and all the other different little esoteric things that I gotten into. And I mean, I've never really and I don't have any plans to, I've never really renounced it and protected myself with the, I'm not a God person. I'm not a Jesus person, and I doubt I ever will be. I guess I've never totally stepped out of that shadow, as it were. And I guess proof is in the pudding in terms of being on whatever's radar. And because I don't like to say darkness or demon. I don't necessarily like those terms. I like in Robert's story, he did make a mention of a comment I had made that there are infinite beings and dimensions, and there are. And I'm assuming he was referring to a comment that I made there. Maybe it was somebody on his team, but
no, it was you. I just didn't say it because I didn't want to, stop the story to jump back and forth.
Jump back, yeah. No, that's fine. But I mean, there's and I mean, even science is looking at it today. The whole idea of multiple dimensions and realities, and they go on to say that each one of these different universes, because that's how they don't say dimension or reality, they say universe. So all these different parallel universes not only Are there, a seemingly infinite variety of them that we see in the math? But chances are physics works differently in all these different dimensions, all these different universes. So if that's the case, then that really does, um, make it seem like there is a possibility. There's a whole universe out there, filled with quote unquote living creatures, although it might not be life as we know it. That we might refer to as spiritual entities. Perhaps they have no physical body because nothing in that universe has a physical body. Maybe we can't even go there. Maybe matter can't even exist there. And I mean, it's something that has been in the metaphysical world forever. Philosophers have talked about it, spiritualists and priests and shamans. I mean, they've talked about these realms and worlds and universes forever. And now our modern science has taken the step into that realm, dare I say, and has now, kind of given it the nod and say, yeah, there's some pretty clear indications in the math and in the theories and in some of our observations with our actual instruments that there are perhaps an entire array of infinite universes, each with a different set of physics and laws to it altogether. So, when we talk about these entities, it doesn't have to be, evil demons in a pit of fire ruled over by a winged horned entity named Lucifer. You and we, mankind, could simply be interacting with at any given time any one of an infinite variety of beings and that we might refer to as being spirits, but just individuals or entities or just life forms, if you will, from one of these other universes.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I actually, that is something that I subscribe to, that there's many, many, many different entities and worlds and universes and dimensions. The only thing is, though, that I still do also believe in is that, there's higher vibrational beings and there's lower vibrational beings.
Of course.
Of many different variations, from the many different dimensions and many different whatever. And, it seems like when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, whether it's a demon or something else, it seems like whatever we're dealing with here are of the lower vibrational kind, and they do mean to have, they're after, they're in it for sinister reasons, whether that's to take control of our body. Like, that seems to be a big thing, right? It's getting control of our body. The other big thing is that they need permission. And I know that we've covered that stuff before, but it seems...
It is an interesting thing to know. And well, I mean, through the mythology, though, we have examples of it all, don't we? We have the good, we have the bad, and we have the otherwise neutral. Sometimes they're just observers, might frighten the shit out of us, but they don't do anything that's as particularly good or bad.
Well, from everything that I've read, it seems like there's being alive right here on Earth as a human, it really is considered...
They might just be observing, and then...
Well, where we're to, it seems from all... Can you hear me?
Stories of the...
We're having an anomalous thing right now. Ryan. Okay. All right. I think we have our own issues right now. So I'm going to leave it there. This was our podcast on demonic phone calls. If you have...
Yeah,
And he's gone. If you have an effed up story on...
Coming through kind of staticky.
Hello, can you hear me now? Ryan? Okay, if you can hear me...
Yes.
if you can hear me, just stay quiet. I'm going to clue this up because we obviously got some issues. So for anybody out there listening, if you have your own effed up story, we'd ask that you submit that to us on our official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the menu, click on submissions, fill out the form, hit submit. We'll get it, put it on the website, possibly put it in a podcast. Actually, we're going to try to get everything submitted ever into a podcast. And in the next week or two, we're doing one on the near-death experiences. So if you have a near-death experience, we definitely want to hear from you, and we'll get it in that podcast. Just get it to us ASAP. And with that said, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and be sure to support us by watching the ads and sharing all of our content. We'll keep it free. Just pay it forward. Help us out a little bit. Share the stuff on your Twitter, on your social media, in your email, on your blogs. You're helping us out a great deal by doing that, and we really appreciate it. And we will bang out as many of these as we can, as often as we can do it. And we appreciate your help. And with that said, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.